Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. Last week, the two Nord Stream pipelines delivering Russian gas to Western Europe were sabotaged, causing massive environmental and financial damage, as well as geopolitical carnage. While the corporate media and intelligence community stooges like former CIA Director John Brennan immediately blame Putin, as they always do with these things, the evidence points elsewhere. Russia had neither the motivation nor the means to execute an attack on its own pipelines. It could have just shut off the gas. But there's more, much more, including the fact that NATO forces recently conducted exercises with mock explosives in the exact same location where the pipelines were blown up. As news of the leaking Nord Stream pipelines spread last week, blame was quickly attached to Putin and Russia. Seismographs that measure the motion of the ground during an earthquake showed that at least 2 explosions had taken place. Soon after, Denmark, the country closest to the unfolding events, confirmed that the pipelines were deliberately blown up. Danish reconnaissance aircraft spotted gas seeping to the surface. The visible disturbance was said to measure more than half a mile. At the time of the incidents, the pipeline system held 300 million cubic meters of gas at a value of $500 million. All of that gas has now gone to waste and is polluting the environment. But that is the least of our worries. The far more important issue is the geopolitical fallout, which in turn depends on who did it. If Russia destroyed its own pipelines, the geopolitical fallout might be manageable. But why would Russia give up such an important lever of power? Russia already demonstrated during the summer that it could exert huge pressure on Western Europe by simply throttling or shutting off the supply of gas. Being able to turn the tap on and off gave Russia huge leverage which it now no longer has. There's also the issue of means and opportunity. The area where the pipelines were blown up is in international waters near the Danish island of Bornholm. Remember that name, it will become very important later on. Bornholm is Danish territory. German, Polish and Swedish ports are all within 60 miles. They're all NATO members, with Sweden joining shortly. The nearest Russian port is at least 200 miles further east if we include the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, and at least 700 miles to the east from the Russian mainland. Logistically, it would be extremely difficult for Russia to send ships or submarines in the area without being detected. Although the pipelines were blown up in international waters, the location was a mere 14 miles from land, in this case Danish land. In essence, the operation to blow up the pipelines happened right on the doorstep of Denmark, surrounded by fellow NATO members. It's highly notable that the attacks took place in international waters immediately on the maritime border of Denmark, as marked with the dotted line. Any Russian vessel would have aroused huge suspicion if it had come that close to Danish waters. Additionally, the area where the pipelines were bombed is extremely busy with marine traffic, making it very risky for a Russian operation to be carried out there. If all of that wasn't enough, the pipelines themselves lie in a depth of around 300 feet and are built very sturdily, with a coating of steel reinforced concrete that is 5 inches thick. It takes a lot of planning and sophistication to take something like that out, especially in 2 locations at the same time as happened last week. The corporate media knows that their narrative about Russia bombing their own pipelines is technically very problematic, which is why one outlet seriously suggested that a Russian oligarch might have dropped some bombs off their mega yacht. What about other possible suspects? As it so happens, the US Navy's 6th Fleet recently conducted exercises and research using mock explosives in the exact location where the pipelines blew up. That research yielded over 200 hours of undersea data in the exact location of the Nord Stream pipelines. Was the Navy mapping the area to the nearest inch so as to be able to later perpetrate a remote attack on the pipeline? We don't know. But what are the chances that it is a complete coincidence that this so-called research was carried out exactly where the pipelines later blew up? Only a few weeks after the US exercises, British forces trained Ukrainian forces in the use of highly sophisticated underwater drones, or ROVs. They then ended up giving the Ukrainians 6 of these advanced drones. Supposedly, these exercises were about mine hunting, but that doesn't mean the drones were not going to be used for other purposes. Then, in early September, an expeditionary detachment of US Navy ships led by the amphibious assault ship USS Kearsarge also conducted exercises around, you know what's coming, Bornholm. And now, a few weeks after all these exercises, the Nord Stream pipelines were mysteriously blown up. Again, we don't know who blew them up, but in terms of means and opportunity, there's far more evidence that NATO forces had something to do with it than that Russia did. If indeed it was the United States that blew up the pipelines, it wouldn't have been the first time. In 1982, the CIA successfully sabotaged a Siberian gas pipeline in the old Soviet Union. Now, let's turn back to motive. As mentioned at the outset, Russia had no obvious motive to blow up its own pipelines. It could have just turned off the tap. With the pipelines destroyed, a huge income source for Russia has been erased, not just now, but also in the future. According to the latest German assessment, the pipelines cannot be fixed. The damage is just too great. $20 billion up in smoke. The only possible motivation Russia might have had to blow up its own pipelines would have been to do it as a false flag operation, to pin the attack on the United States and then use that as a pretext for retaliation. That, however, is a very unlikely scenario. Russia has a lot of problems fighting the Ukraine war as it is. Attacking the US does not seem to fit into that reality. Also, if Russia wanted a pretext for retaliating against the United States, there are plenty of pretexts already, in particular the use of US weapons to attack Russian soldiers and Russian territory, things that will only grow more intense as Russia incorporates eastern parts of Ukraine into its own territory. And if it was a false flag attack by Russia, why weren't any flags left behind? Talking about false flags, the CIA recently warned Germany that someone might attack the Nord Stream pipelines. So what about other belligerents, the US, the UK, Ukraine, and perhaps other NATO countries? What is their possible motivation to blow up the pipelines? Ukraine easily has the most incentives. Any remaining Russian gas deliveries will now need to transit through Ukraine, where Ukraine can charge fees as well as gain some measure of control over the shipments. In fact, Ukraine was not a fan of Nord Stream as it bypassed Ukrainian tolls, delivering gas straight from Russia to Germany. Plus, of course, there's the fact that anything that's bad for Russia is good for Ukraine right now. What about the US, UK, and other NATO countries? They have their own possible motivations. First, there's simple financial and trading issues at stake. The US has long wanted Europe to buy American energy instead of Russian energy. That is now guaranteed to happen. There's also the strange case of the new Norwegian pipeline that delivers gas to Poland. Incredibly, that pipeline opened on the exact day that the Russian pipelines were bombed. What a coincidence. What's also strange is that if Russia blew up its own pipelines, why did it not also blow up the Norwegian pipeline, which coincidentally happens to run past Bornholm as well? Why blow up their own but not their competitor's pipeline, which will now get a huge boost? The clearest evidence that it was not Russia who blew up the pipelines comes straight out of Joe Biden's mouth.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will. I promise you we'll be able to do that.
That was in February, with Biden very clearly foreshadowing what has now happened. A month earlier, Biden's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, also prophesied the fate of Nord Stream.
Some may see Nord Stream 2 as leverage that Russia can use against Europe. In fact, it's leverage for Europe to use against Russia.
Then there's Biden's Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland. We've reported on her on this show before. She's the notorious neocon who started the whole mess in Ukraine when she organized a coup in that country in 2014, replacing the elected leader with her own puppet. Well, earlier this year, Nuland too said that Nord Stream would be ended, one way or another.
With regard to Nord Stream 2, we continue to have very strong and clear conversations with our German allies, and I want to be clear with you today. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
Note Nuland's tone when talking about Germany, saying that she had had strong and clear conversations with Germany. That was because she didn't want Germany to buy Russian gas. Meanwhile, the German population, who is facing a massive energy crisis with prices already being 10 times more than just a few months ago, has started demanding more Russian energy and an end to Russian sanctions. Sanctions which have hurt Germans far more than they've hurt Russians. There was a real possibility that with winter fast approaching, Germany would have sought some form of understanding with Russia rather than completely ruining its own country. Well, that's off the table now, because even if there is some kind of understanding, there's no pipeline to deliver all that energy. The possibility of restarting gas flows is gone, for good. Lastly, there's Radek Sikorski's tweet thanking the United States for blowing up the pipeline. You might say, who's that and why does it matter what this guy says? Well, Sikorski is the chairman of the EU-US delegation in the European Parliament. Before that, he was Defense Secretary as well as Foreign Secretary of Poland, Ukraine's closest ally. He's also the husband of Anne Applebaum, another notorious neocon, Russia hater, and Trump-Russia collusion fanatic. Oh, and he's friends with Joe Biden. He's the kind of person who might have been read in on what was about to happen, and he couldn't help himself but brag about it on Twitter. So there it is. That's what we know about the situation so far. The truth is far more complex than what the corporate media claims. To be clear, we are not saying that it is completely impossible that Russia blew up its own pipeline. What we are saying is that other countries had far greater motives, means, and opportunities to do so. The danger in all of this is a massive escalation of the Ukraine war. If the US or its allies did indeed blow up the pipeline, Russia would be well within its rights to retaliate or even claim that it was an act of war. The truth is that we are far closer to massive international conflict than most people realize. Thanks for joining us in today's episode of Truth Over News.